Interaction is a well-trodden question within the EDH community, with raging debates over how much is too much, how little is too little, what types are the best, and what types are the rudest. I've thrown my hat in this ring before, but what has struck me recently is how many people seem to not really understand interaction as a concept, and what it is accomplishing for any given deck. As with many subjects, we as the EDH community have created lots of little myths about interaction and removal. When I say myths, I don't mean strictly untrue statements, but rather kinda true things accepted as undeniable fact, or sometimes true things overgeneralized to be always true. So I want to tackle some of these misunderstandings, and in the process drill into the fundamentals of what interaction does, why different decks want it, and how best to use it. To start with, let's talk about what's worth considering alongside your removal when deck building. I've occasionally gotten some flack because I tend to have a pretty wide scope of what I consider interaction and removal, and I'll sometimes organize my interaction suites in ways that other people find unintuitive. Graveyard exiling is a form of removal, bounce spells are a form of removal, and defensive cards like propaganda are a form of removal, though the degree this label will fit will depend on the deck. I think the reason this rubs people wrong is because they have a very specific idea of what removal entails. Removal is when you remove an opposing thing, and more specific tools like defensive cards, graveyard hate protection, and pinpoint land destruction deserve to be placed in an entirely different mental category, their own boxes on a checklist. In some decks, these things will warrant this sort of separation, but in many others, doing this is a waste of time at best, and in the worst cases, actively counterproductive to constructing a functional deck. No, instead of this sort of checklist approach, the best way to think about interaction is as a network of overlapping solutions to a number of specific game states. Let's say an opponent plays Animate Dead to bring back an Archon of Cruelty, and let's say this poses a problem to us. How can we shut this down before they start attacking us with it? Well, we could destroy the Archon of Cruelty with creature removal, we could destroy the Animate Dead with enchantment removal, we could counter the Animate Dead with a counterspell, and we could use instant speed graveyard hate to exile Archon of Cruelty in response. There are some less common approaches as well, but let's stick with these four. In this case, all four of these options would be ways of removing this threat, dealing with this game state that I've decided is problematic to us. I'll allow myself a single cheeky comment here and point out that, for our purposes here, Abrade is not a removal spell, and Cremate is. For another example, let's say our opponent is playing a Krenko deck and is starting to pop off. Several goblins, a couple sources of untapping, an anger in the graveyard, the works. A piece of instant speed creature removal could deal with this, so long as Krenko isn't wearing a Swiftfoot boots or something. However, there are a number of less absolute ways to slow down or survive this sort of play. You could have a Soul Sister out to allow your life total to keep pace with the number of goblins on board, or you could have a defensive card like Ghostly Prison already in play to limit the number of attackers. You could even have a Thalia Heretic Cathar to have the goblins enter tapped, or have a Rakdos Charm at the ready to explode your opponent's life total as punishment for their token crimes. Now, just what point am I trying to make here, you might ask? Put simply, in EDH, problems are often more complicated than one single problem permanent that needs to be removed, and even more complicated than just being the occasional spooky board that needs wiping. Single target removal and generic board wipes can be the solution to a lot of problems, and I'd never tell you to avoid these cards, but they're far from the only options available, and a lot of times they won't be the most efficient way to tackle a given problem. Sources of graveyard exile are generally extremely cheap per mana, as are stacks cards, defensive permanents, and other things that stick around to hinder multiple opposing plays. As a result, it's beneficial to get to know these types of cards and the sorts of decks and metagames where they could play the role of more traditional removal better. When newer players are being inducted into the ways of the Commander format, discussions of interaction tend to center card types as the thing to focus on. You want a way to hit creatures, to hit artifacts, to hit enchantments, and so on. To be clear, I have no problem with this. Card types are undoubtedly a good thing to think about as a starting point. However, as you get acquainted with more common play patterns of decks, and which ones you tend to have a problem with, it becomes much more useful to focus on situations that need to be remedied. Some decks won't care about certain types of threats as much. A go-wide token stack isn't going to be as spooky if you're playing a thick boarded mid-range deck. A pinging engine isn't going to be as spooky if you're playing a deck with a good amount of life gain. Decks with more explosive plays aren't going to be as spooky if you're already packing a handful of hate pieces, and so on. If you're playing a deck with a focus on some defensive cards, you're already going to be somewhat shielded from a lot of plays that involve large combat steps. And if you're playing a deck that runs some counterspells for protection, you're already going to have some ways to nail critical centerpiece cards or combos. Likewise, an interaction suite that does a good job of handling the threats of one table might not do as good a job at a different table. You need to know the environment you're stepping into. To clarify, if what I'm saying sounds overwhelming, you shouldn't worry about it too much. What I'm describing is what takes place during a potentially months-long process of tuning and pruning a deck, not necessarily what you should be doing when you're first putting together a deck. It's fine if you're using templates or rough rules of thumb to start out with, but as you get deeper into tuning an individual deck, and as you get more experienced as a deck builder, it's generally good to move away from deciding counts of different cards using a simple template. There's no way to know exactly how many removal spells or overall interaction spells you need, because different forms of removal will have overlap in the profile of what they can answer, and different interaction spells will have different degrees in how much they hinder opposing plays. Not to mention, different decks run different amounts of draw. Some of my decks will run interaction counts in the teens, but others might run 20-something or even 30-something cards that interact with the resources of opponents in some way, excluding life total. And excluding life total isn't even necessarily a fair thing to do. I don't know if you've ever watched how a person with 14 life conducts themselves in a commander game, but it's generally very different than how somebody with 34 life conducts themselves. That 14 life person will often find themselves holding back on attacks and chump blocking more often than they'd like, and they're also going to be more conservative in the sorts of spells they play. Tapping out to draw a bunch of cards or play some powerful amplifier permanent is perfectly commonplace for somebody at a higher life total, but it's a terrifying proposition when finding just a little bit of extra damage could let an opponent swing lethal. For that reason, having a higher degree of life total pressure can often allow for a bit smaller of a removal count. All sorts of late game permanents that would generally be good candidates for removal become a lot less of a concern if their controller is in range of being rapidly focused down. This is one reason why Magister Sphinx is such a useful card in my Shroom Slide deck. The deck generally looks to build toward a late game win, so having a way to put an opponent on death's door if they're pushing out of control a bit too early is a sweet escape valve that takes a bit of pressure off the deck's control spells. Overall though, this life total rule is generally going to be most pertinent in aggro decks, and especially in Voltron decks, which typically look to knock down players one at a time with commander damage. Careful threat assessment and a few swings with a big commander can be worth countless pieces of removal, and for the pieces of removal that do exist in a deck, it can be beneficial to have them be targeted more towards the stages of the game that are worth worrying about. Get rid of some blockers, kill something that can let an opponent stabilize, remove a bigger mana dork that might let an opponent contest you. Flame Slash isn't going to be a great card in most slower decks because it misses a whole lot of stuff that you'll see in the later stages of Commander game, but that's not super important if your most important turns are going to be happening earlier. Ultimately, all I'm trying to say here is that different decks will utilize removal for very different purposes. If you're playing a creature-based aggressive deck, you might want to focus on options that can clear out blockers, and you likely won't want much in the way of conventional board wipes unless you have ways to make them one-sided. If you're playing a combo deck, you'll want to focus your interaction on dealing with obstacles to your combo, and spending removal on only the most imminent of threats. In either of these cases, your interaction will exist predominantly to buy yourself time, and things opponents have that require time on their end, like draw or a mana engine, might not be a concern to you at all. By contrast, if you're playing a slower, more controlling deck, you'll want to focus more of your removal on knocking out resource generation, such as card draw engines, since not letting opponents get ahead of you will be important in winning in the long game. You also might want to focus on interaction that targets multiple things, or which accomplishes multiple tasks, since those tend to be more card efficient. These cards do tend to cost more mana though, which brings me to the final myth I want to tackle. Let's talk about the interaction staples of the format, specifically when they should be played or not played. Typically, the forms of removal considered staples are the ones that cost very little mana and hit a limited range of targets, such as Nature's Claim, or which cost a bit more mana but which hit a variety of different targets, such as Generous Gift. There are also a handful of board wipes that end up heavily played because they're just hands down the best thing available in a given color. Now, am I about to explain to you why these cards are garbage that you need to rip out of your deck? No. In fact, I'm about to tell you exactly why these cards are generally so good, because I think a lot of people have a tendency to accept that these cards are always the best option and treat it as dogma, a primordial and unshakable feature of our world alongside gravity and the rising of the sun, and this does these cards a bit of a disservice. Let's start with flexible removal spells. Why are Beast Within, Chaos Warp, and Generous Gift good cards? Right off the bat, let's make something clear. One of these cards I'm a lot less likely to play than the other two. Can you guess which one? If you said Generous Gift, you're correct, and that's not an insult to the card itself. It's functionally identical to Beast Within, after all, unless your opponent is playing an elephant deck. No, I merely say this to gesture at the fact that Beast Within and Chaos Warp are exceptional cards. They are hard removal in colors that don't really have access to much hard removal for creatures, and in the case of Chaos Warp, in a color that lacks enchantment removal on top of that. there are several 2-color combinations in which these will be some of the only removal for certain permanent types you'll get, and that's to say nothing of our monocolored compatriots. So you won't catch me wasting my breath trying to get people to take these out of their decks. However, there are also 2-color combinations where you'll have access to lots of other options. Beast Within won't feel as essential in a green-black deck since you'll have a number of other reliable ways to remove creatures. And, as I alluded to earlier, any deck that includes white is going to have ways to deal with the variety of permanent types already available. So, does that mean these cards aren't worth playing in color combinations where they're not in some wholly unique niche? Not necessarily. For one, these hit lands, though the importance of that can vary a lot depending on the power level and matchup you find yourself in. Secondly, if your interaction suite is relatively narrow, somewhere in the ballpark of 8 to 12 cards, there will be a lot of utility in having each of those cards be as flexible as possible. If I'm packing 9 pieces of interaction, after my first 7 draws of the game plus my opening hand, I've on average seen around 1 1/4 of these. If I'm running 14 pieces of interaction, I've seen around 2 instead, and if I'm running 18 pieces of interaction, that number is more than 2.5. If I have a diverse interaction suite and I'm seeing multiple pieces of interaction pretty early into a game, there's a good chance I'll have a way to deal with a specific problem unfolding in front of me. But if that average is lower, running more of these versatile staples will likely be a good idea. Personally, I prefer to run a higher count of interaction that's more carefully integrated into what my deck is doing, but there will be times when it makes sense to run a lower count. Some decks can threaten player kills or wins faster, in which case removal won't be as necessary, and other decks will be tight on deck space and might struggle to integrate removal into what they're doing. Regardless, versatility of removal is going to be one of the deck building knobs that you can modulate, and it's good to have an understanding of when it's more important and when it's less. Now let's get to the cheapest removal out there, your 0, 1, and 2 mana options. These are powerful for a very simple reason. They're just mana efficient. If you're exiling a 4 or 5 mana creature with a Swords to Plowshares, that's going to be a significant tempo advantage. This will be most relevant in a fast, proactive deck, one that is mostly dialed in on its own game plan and just needs little bits of removal it can fit in around the edges of turns in order to prevent opponents from causing problems. The most extreme cases of this are in CEDH. Here, almost all instant speed interaction is going to be 0 to 1 mana, and you'll sometimes see 1 mana bounce spells played because it's just that worthwhile to temporarily deal with any non-land permanent for 1 mana. Even if you're not playing some insane combo deck trying to pop off on turn 4, low-cost removal options can still feel quite good if you're willing to play a lot of card draw. Because that's the downside of these. They're single target removal, and some of the most popular options actively give your opponent a thing, so by default you're going to be falling behind the table in cards. If you're happy to go ham on card draw in order to counteract this fact, that's fine enough, but going for removal that can hit more targets or which provides some other benefit can really help a deck to keep up in cards and run smoothly, especially if there's a lot of elements to fit into a deck that will be taxing your deck space. If you want a stronger sense of how to densify a removal suite like this, I'd recommend watching my removal video from 11 months ago, because that was a large part of that video. I said earlier that 0 to 2 mana removal is strong due to its mana efficiency, and for some use cases, that's actually kind of an understatement. Specifically, anytime a deck is holding up mana to use interaction at instant speed, there is effectively a mana cost associated with that, since if the interaction wasn't needed, the mana goes unspent. This is one reason why 1 mana options are popular among the instant speed kill spells, and it's also why low-cost counterspells are especially highly prioritized in EDH. And that's good and fine. A deck with mostly sorcery speed plays will want its counterspells as cheaply costed as possible, but, as with low-cost removal, the issue comes when players treat this preference as unshakable dogma. 3 mana counterspells aren't inherently bad, nor are 4 mana counterspells, or 5 mana counterspells. What matters is whether you have other things to do with that mana you hold up. The simplest version of this is in something like a Drago-style control deck. My friend Hans has a Lila undefeated slickshot deck that follows a simple premise. There's 20 blue-red instants that draw cards and or remove things, and once Lila is on board, the deck plays very reactively, mostly only casting plotted spells on its own turn, a thing that doesn't require mana. This allows it to play a suite of exclusively high mana cost counterspells, which can have backbreaking upsides compared to their low-cost counterparts. Aether Snatch fully yoinks an opposing spell. Sublime Epiphany does a whole bunch of stuff, and ending the turn with Time Stop in response to a critical main phase spell or ability can be equal parts hilarious and devastating. You might argue that this is niche advice, since most decks aren't going to be playing at instant speed, but it's nonetheless good to keep in mind as an option. The other way to have higher costed options make sense is by having unspent mana roll over between turns in some way. Storage lands or a Krufix adjacent commander might come to mind here, but the most well-supported option for this is treasures. You can spend treasures on counterspells if they're needed, and if they aren't needed, the treasures get to stick around. Finally, there are also a smaller number of counterspells with built-in modality. I'm a big fan of Mystic Confluence, and Cryptic Command and Thassa's Intervention are other cards that also feel fine enough if played for their other modes. This is also why 3 Steps Ahead has broken the 3-mana counterspell mold and actually seen decent levels of play. It can be a 3-mana counterspell, but if it's not needed, it can also be a 3-mana filtering spell, and it can soak up extra mana with decently mana-efficient results. There aren't a ton of amazing modal counterspells at the moment, but this is definitely an area that I'd keep an eye on, and if we see more options like this printed, I could see EDH shifting toward higher-costed counterspells. As a final note, counterspells are one of the rare types of card that will consistently embody multiple roles in decks. They're a form of removal in the sense that they can nail pivotal spells from opponents, and they're useful for protection since they can counter opposing interaction. When I'm deck building, how I categorize them will depend a lot on how important protection is for my game plan. If I expect to have critical plays my opponents will be trying to answer, I'll generally either put counterspells in their own category, or lump them into a protection category along with some other sorts of protection cards. Sometimes I'll even throw recursion spells into a protection category as well, if there are critical permanents to protect, which can help with conceptualizing a deck, so long as you keep in mind that different cards are accomplishing the protection task in different ways. On the other hand, if I have less to protect and I expect my counterspells to be mostly aimed at stopping my opponent's plays, putting them in their own category is less helpful for understanding my deck, and I'm more likely to lump them in with the other interaction in a deck. And that's what this is about. How you categorize your cards matters for being able to understand your own deck and make sure you're able to accomplish the different tasks you want to accomplish. My Sharoom Slide deck does use its 7 counterspells for protection sometimes, but I keep these cards in the broader control category because these cards are a bit too messy in what they accomplish to put into a standalone category. 3 of them are counterspells with cycling that can be used as fuel for Astral Slide, 1 also serves as a flickerable removal engine, 1 of them has Transmute, and how am I even supposed to categorize what Nimble Obstructionist does? In this case, the interaction suite of this deck is too convoluted and multifaceted to be worth trying to make more digestible, and I know any overhaul of it is going to require a whole lot of effort anyway. The one aspect of my control suite I do differentiate with a subcategory is the creatures with ETBs, since building flicker-based engines to suppress opponents is a key part of the deck, and if I click the category in Architect to select those cards, this becomes evident. I have other decks I could go into detail discussing the interaction suites of and how I categorize them, but that would pretty well destroy the pacing of this video. However, in preparation for Magic on Vegas, I'm doing audits of a bunch of my decks, and so I'm releasing a bonus segment of how the interaction suites of each of my decks are looking and what changes I'm looking to make before Vegas. Some of these decks I haven't visited a whole lot lately, so it's kind of fun evaluating the decisions of my past self. To access that, you can either join my Patreon or my newly launched YouTube membership. This video will be in both places. With that said, thanks for watching, and here's a preview of that video. Like, on a technical level, the interaction numbers are super high here. Like, I have like 20 discard spells, 11 cards I would call removal for permanents, like 5 graveyard hate cards plus a couple others in other categories. So like, in theory, we're packing a lot of ways to involve ourselves with our opponents in some way. So among these, there are going to be some like damage-based creature removal. I think there are 4 of these. 4 of them are going to be targeted creature removal, like Fel the Profane, and then 1 enchantment removal, which is going to be Withering Torment, and 3 artifact removal. There's some overlap in these categories. Some of these do multiple, but that's what's going on here. I think the weak point here would probably be enchantment removal, particularly given that there are a lot of enchantments that are going to be generating card advantage. So not having a way to deal with that seems like a problem here. I'm also kind of looking sideways at Bedevil right now, honestly, because I'm running this instead of Chaos Warp, and I'm questioning why Chaos Warp isn't here to deal with multiple permanent types. You know, this is harder on the mana, hits fewer permanent types. I like the Rakdos vibes. Love the vibes here. You know, I kind of like the mana cost as like a flavor thing as well, but yeah, this feels like a weird inclusion. I don't know. I'll probably find a way to fit Chaos Warp into here because I think that really probably belongs in here. I might look for another piece of enchantment removal as well, but I think getting up to 2 will be good. Beyond that, I'm actually pretty happy with this deck's removal base. We've got kind of a lot of ways to kill small creatures. So we've got like Fiery Confluence, Mizium Mortars. We've got the discard spell. What is it? Let's Play game. Yeah, that one can kill small creatures too. Carter can go to a whole bunch of creatures, and it's obviously stronger against smaller creatures. And I think that's going to be especially important because Malphegor just doesn't handle tokens well. So I think having that, having a little bit of Blood Artist stuff here and there, that should help deal with the token matchups, which I like a lot.